Today I'm here with Nadine Strawson, who I'm very excited to speak to. Nadine is the former president of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which was from 1991 to 2008, and she's now on their National Advisory Council. Her most recent book from 2018 is called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, and she is now Professor Emerita at New York Law School. So Nadine, thank you so much. I've been really looking forward to this. You're someone I've been listening to and reading and watching about free speech for a while. I think I may have quoted you on this channel before. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Sasha.
So I wanted to start off just by asking you to tell people a bit about your own background and what kind of in your personal life led you to become such a staunch supporter of First Amendment rights.
As far back as I can remember, Sasha, I have believed in the right of every individual, including young children, because I started having this belief when I was a young child, the right of each of us to formulate our own thoughts and beliefs and to express them and to exchange ideas with other people. And I really rebelled against the restrictions that we take for granted. To be imposed on young children, including by parents and including by teachers. Now, I understand that there's a need for discipline, but I was disciplined for asking questions that I was told were inappropriate or beyond my age level, things like that. And I felt really, really thwarted in that regard. Let me mention one other example, which is the public library in the town where I grew up, which was a suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota. My parents weren't wealthy. They didn't buy books. So the public library was the place, and the school library were the places where I got books, and I loved to read. Well, the public library in Hopkins, Minnesota restricted access to almost all books by people under the age of 18. Until I turned 18, I was relegated to 2 rooms in that entire library, and I had read and reread every single book in those rooms many, many times over, probably before I even became a teenager. So all of this made me very frustrated. And when I learned that there is a constitution that contains a First Amendment free speech guarantee, that there's an organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, that is dedicated to promoting that right, it was just like, I found exactly what I had been searching for without knowing it. Now, I have to say, when I tell these stories, I sometimes think, well, if we want to produce future civil libertarians, we've got to suppress them when they're young, and then they'll rebel against it. And no, I'm very, very happy that since then the American Library Association has protected young people's access to free speech, to books throughout the library, that the United States Supreme Court has protected school students' free speech rights in an ACLU case, I'm happy to say. But it's, I really do believe that all of us, no matter what age, no matter what beliefs, no matter whatever pigeonhole society wants to put us into, we are all entitled equally to self-expression and to exchanging ideas with others.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of the biggest challenges when you were heading the ACLU that you faced in terms of defending civil liberties?
Oh my goodness. Basically, whatever the hot issues are in that particular slice of history, there is a civil liberties dimension. To mention just 2 biggies out of an 18-year period. One would be the development of the internet. Obviously, scientists had developed it earlier, but it really sprang upon the public and political and media radar screen in the early 1990s, early in my ACLU presidency. And this new medium, with its wonderful power to transmit ideas and information more quickly, more cheaply, more widely than any medium had done in the past, while civil libertarians and human rights activists greeted this with joy, there were a lot of other people who greeted it with fear and trepidation, as has happened to every new medium throughout history, and certainly including the printing press. And so, not surprisingly, the first response of Congress was to pass a very speech suppressive law that the ACLU lobbied against and ultimately litigated against successfully, leading to a landmark case that I'm so proud is called Reno, as in Janet Reno, President Bill Clinton's Attorney General, versus ACLU. And the Supreme Court essentially unanimously agreed with the ACLU that the internet should be entitled to the highest level of free speech protection of all media, not the lowest, along with broadcasting, which is what the government was arguing. And I have to say, the government, meaning the Clinton administration, Democrats as well as Republicans, supported this censorship. So I'm very proud that we prevailed and continue to advocate for online free speech, a subject of great continuing importance. I would say the other major historical development during that period were the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I mean, since then, we are living in a post 9/11 world, I'm sorry to say, where increasing government surveillance, even of people who are not even suspected of terrorism, are just taken for granted. They are now built into our legal structure, initially thought to be justified as only temporary measures to deal with this extraordinary crisis of terrorism. But there's a historic pattern. Once government gets power, it never gives it up. Even when the ostensible situation that justified the power has long evaporated, the power persists. And that's, those, as I think about it, as I put those two events together, the development of the internet and the terrorist attacks and the increasing pervasive surveillance of our communications, that's created a perfect storm, which have allowed the tech giants to engage in absolutely pervasive surveillance of all of our communications, putting together detailed profiles of all of us, and apparently able to manipulate through algorithms what material we see, what we don't see. This is a very disturbing development. So no shortage of big issues ever.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious what you think about sort of the big tech issue today. I mean, we see similar things. There have been Democratic politicians who have encouraged big tech companies to increase censorship or moderation in some regards, and then Twitter and Facebook actually banned the former president Donald Trump. And I'm curious what you think of that. Is that legal? Is that constitutional for that to happen? I mean, it's a private company, so we know they're not actually subject to the Constitution, but yeah, what's your opinion on that?
I think that it is almost certainly within the constitutional power of these private sector entities, as you say, to make their own decisions about what content and what speakers they do host and which they don't host on their platforms. It's the same editorial function that you're exercising, Sasha, when you decide whom you're going to interview on your podcast. And I'm so honored that you exercise your discretion to invite me and whom you're not going to. The reason I say it's almost certain is lately there have been a few arguments, including by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, that perhaps these companies should not be viewed as strictly private. Perhaps they should be treated as analogous to public accommodations, essential infrastructure, common carrier, such as the old landline telephone networks, and therefore be subject to regulation, including regulation that would require fair and equal and non-discriminatory access to all would-be users. I think that's a very uphill argument, but put aside the legalities. There are, we still have to talk about what should the conduct be by these companies? What should their practices be? If we don't have the Constitution available as a weapon to enforce First Amendment free speech rights for speakers who get kicked off, then we have to look for other legal tools or indeed other non-legal tools. After all, private companies are very responsive to consumer pressure, right? To employee pressure. Unfortunately, a lot of the pressure seems to be coming from employees and consumers who are pressuring these companies to kick off even more and more speech. Those of us who have a different view, of which I certainly include myself, have to do a better job of agitating for the opposite, and to tell these companies that we want them to engage in more the unfettered kind of expression that was what the internet was originally foreseen as facilitating.
Mhm. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about is sort of my generation or the millennials' view of free speech, because something that I feel in the air among a lot of people my age, university students or in the professional workplace, is a sort of hesitancy to embrace free speech as a value. And there is this idea that I feel is going around that free speech is almost opposing to other social justice issues like racial justice, or the fight for equality of the sexes, and fight against homophobia and all those things like that. So, and now I know this isn't necessarily a new tension, because I've heard you speak about this and a little bit about the history of this, but what do you make of this moment? And do you agree that this is in the air? I mean, in your dealings with students, does this come up?
It certainly does, Sasha, but it has also come up before, as you rightly note. And I'm old enough that I can say I see cycles being repeated, at least in every generation, if not even more frequently than that. And I welcome it, because every generation, indeed every individual, has to revisit for herself or himself, um, I have to say, or their selves, right? What the issues are and what the principles are. Just, I would be the last person to say, well, just because the First Amendment has been around for a long time, or just because a certain Supreme Court decision has been around for a long time, that means we have to adhere to it. That means it's right. No, we should re-examine what the principles are, and are they justified? And I know it's hard for each of us as an individual to overcome our own biases, but I try to the best of my human ability to constantly re-examine, to constantly question. It's one of the reasons I really enjoy speaking and debating and discussing, because I welcome the challenge to my own ideas. And so let me say this, that so far, uh, through all of my constant re-examination, including what was going on today and something I was researching, I continue to be convinced that robust freedom of speech is the absolutely essential prerequisite for any other cause, certainly including the types of social justice and equal rights causes that you rightly alluded to: racial justice, gender justice, justice for LGBTQ, et cetera, folks, especially those who have lacked political power, right? By definition, are never going to be able to consistently depend on the majoritarian branches of government, right? The ones that are elected by the majority of their constituencies. By definition, they're responsive to those in the majority, and not so beholden to those who are minorities, either ethnic or other kinds of demographic minorities or political minorities. So it is therefore this special tool, indeed often the only tool, of members of minority groups, those who have traditionally been disempowered, is to use their First Amendment rights: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. And as we look throughout US history and around the world, it has been the robust exercise of free speech rights that has brought success to movements, from the abolition movement to the civil rights movement to women's suffrage to reproductive freedom to LGBTQ rights and so forth. Conversely, government has consistently throughout history tried to stifle those voices.
Mhm. So could it be seen that the free speech rights are kind of an antidote to the potential of democracy to be a mob rule?
You've said it extremely well. In the United States, we have a democratic republic, which does not mean that the majority has complete control and dominion over every single issue. Yes, the majority has the power through elected representatives accountable to we the people, to quote the opening words in the United States Constitution. The majority does have the prerogative to decide most public policy issues, but we have a Bill of Rights that was added to our Constitution to make absolutely clear what I think was, and experts, including the framers themselves, thought was implicit in the original Constitution, but they made it extra clear to err on the side of emphasis, that there are certain rights that are so fundamental that no majority, no matter how large or powerful, can take those rights away from any minority, no matter how despised or tiny that minority might be. And those fundamental freedoms certainly include those enumerated in the First Amendment, freedom of thought and conscience and association and religion and speech and press.
Mhm. So what might you say to a student who comes to you and says, I understand freedom of speech is important, but there is this, sometimes people reference this paradox of tolerance that I think comes from the writer Karl Popper, and some people misuse this idea, but so say a student comes to you and says, there's this paradox where if we allow all speech, then oppressive or intolerant speech will be allowed too, and that will automatically lead to an intolerant, repressive society. So therefore, we should stifle some free speech if it's discriminatory.
There are several responses to that very important question, Sasha, and one of them is, it's certainly not true that intolerant speech will necessarily lead to an intolerant society. That assumes a very mechanistic, robotic, simplistic view of human nature, which I certainly hope intelligent people in your generation would reject, right? That if for the person who asked me that question, I would turn it back on her and say, when you listen to whatever you consider to be hateful speech, let's assume the Unite the Right demonstrators in Charlottesville in 2017, when they're brandishing their tiki torches and chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." Does that turn you into a supporter of the Unite the Right movement? Does that turn you into someone who hates refugees and Jews and supports white supremacy? I'm sure the answer is going to be no. So why do you make that negative assumption about your fellow citizens, that they are all going to be bamboozled by this hateful rhetoric, as opposed to, and the numbers show, the overwhelming majority of people who heard that speech were galvanized to organize against it, to demonstrate against Unite the Right, to have counter demonstrations, not only in Charlottesville, but all over the country. And so there is no simplistic cause and effect between hearing a hateful idea and the idea becoming accepted and powerful. Another really important response, Sasha, is that yes, it is true that dangerous ideas may be accepted. I think it's dangerous for people to advocate censorship, for example, but as you rightly said, those ideas are gaining a lot of support in a lot of constituencies that used to be very supportive of free speech, including academia and journalism and publishing. So those are dangerous ideas that do a lot of harm in the real world by my standards. But we always have to ask the question, what is the lesser of two evils? Is it taking our chances with the marketplace of ideas, or is it empowering a government official to enforce a certain orthodoxy? And again, I think history continues to demonstrate that the greater danger is empowering government, because that not only denies individual liberty, but it also is completely inconsistent with democracy, where again, we, the people, wield the sovereign power. How can we possibly do that unless we're free to vigorously debate and discuss these issues of public policy?
Mm. And what about this idea that speech can be harmful and that words themselves can be an act of discrimination or, a almost material form of prejudice? That I'm hearing a lot that words are harm.
There's, I'd say it's absolutely undebatable that words can do harm. Where I would differ is the absolute pronouncements that words are harmful. The difference between words or other kinds of expression, symbolic conduct, and let's say punching somebody in the face. And this is where, that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That is not a descriptive statement. Obviously, words hurt us all the time. They can break our hearts, they can hurt our feelings, they can wound our pride, and so on and so forth. And I do believe that certain hateful speech and other speech can be deeply traumatizing to particular individuals in particular circumstances, with adverse effects not only on their emotions and their psyche, but also adverse physiological effects, causing increased heart rate and stress, and also having a silencing impact, right? If somebody says something intimidating or insulting, then it's going to chill your exercise of your free speech rights. But what that old saying is getting at is like it's an exhortation. You should not let words hurt you, right? Because in order for a word to have a hurtful or another negative impact, it has to go through the intermediating process of the human brain. So I already gave one example. I hear Unite the Right engaging in its odious white supremacist expression. I'm processing that through my experience, through my perspective, and I process that as I've got to organize more to oppose you folks in the political sphere to make sure that you do not gain power through being elected to office or persuading office holders. So that's how I process their speech. And I just, if somebody tries to insult me, I try to see that as reflecting negatively on them, not on me. I recently had the honor of doing a book launch interview for a wonderful new book by Jonathan Rauch, Brookings Institution Fellow. And the book is called The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. John was a longtime crusader for LGBTQ rights, including the right to marriage, when that was just a complete voice in the wilderness. He and the ACLU and very few others were advocating it. And he said, if somebody in this book, he said, if somebody calls me a fucking faggot, I process that as she needs counseling, not that I am a fucking faggot.
Mm. Yeah, that's an important thing. I mean, to be able to filter things that way and hear things that you don't have to believe or attach onto yourself when people throw labels at you or insults. And you mentioned Charlottesville and the Unite the Right protest that happened when someone died when a car drove into the protesters, and the ACLU had defended the right of the group to protest there. And then now there was a recent New York Times article that talked about what they called the identity crisis of the ACLU. And they were asserting that after the Charlottesville incident, there was sort of this internal feeling of unease at the ACLU that some people felt they shouldn't have come to the defense of the protesters there to protest there. And then some people were sticking to the value of we defend anybody's right to protest, including like going back to the history of the Nazis marching in Skokie, Illinois. Do you think this New York Times article is accurate? Can you speak to that? Is there what kind of conversations are happening at the ACLU, if you can give us an insight into that?
Very, very important question, Sasha. And before I address it, though, I want to add one point to my last answer about how we hope that people who are the subject of hateful speech, especially when it's targeted directly at them, can have the self-confidence and sense of dignity to be able to not let it adversely affect them. I want to be very, very clear that if somebody is in fact hurt, I'm not at all trying to blame the victim. And I have been subject to hateful speech. And in one very dramatic instance, it did have a silencing and traumatizing impact on me, despite all of my education and speaking out. So I completely have sympathy for people who do experience the hurtful impact of words. But I just urge them to know that they can surmount it. There are experts who can help them do that. And there are countless people in this society who could and should, and I think will, stand up for them and against the person who is trying to hurt them. Now, to the very, very important series of questions you raised about the Charlottesville situation. I actually wrote something about this almost exactly a year ago on the anniversary of Charlottesville, explaining why I think the ACLU was completely correct to defend the First Amendment rights of the Unite the Right demonstrators, why the judge was completely correct to uphold those rights. And it ties into the last part of your question. So let me explain it for listeners, please, Sasha. That at that time, before the rally took place, there was absolutely no evidence of any planned or threatened violence at all. To the contrary, the organizers of the parade, swore that it was going to be completely peaceful. Even more significantly, the chief of police testified in that court proceeding that they had no information or intelligence about any planned violence. And if any violence did erupt, that they were completely prepared to protect public safety and to quell the violence. So based on that record and the fact that the city councilors who asked to cancel the permit to move the planned and permitted demonstration to another area altogether, members of the city council were testifying about how odious they considered the views of the Unite the Right to be. Well, I certainly consider those views odious too, but a fundamental precept of freedom of speech is government may never stifle speech, or in this case, disfavor it by moving it to a unchoice location, simply because of disagreement or dislike of the viewpoint. And here there was no other rationale. There was no public safety rationale. At the point when law and order broke down and it became clear that the police at every level were not, in fact, prepared for the violence that was, in fact, planned, at that point, there should have been a clampdown on the protesters, but that did not happen. So it was a failure of law enforcement, not a failure of the failure of overprotecting the First Amendment. And I should say that I'm paraphrasing a very detailed report that was done after the fact by a law firm that had been commissioned to do a nonpartisan evaluation of what went wrong, commissioned by the city council. Now, it's absolutely true that there are debates within the ACLU today, as there were during the historic Skokie case that you mentioned, which goes way back to 1977, as there have been throughout the ACLU's 100-year history. We have always defended freedom of speech, even for fascists and extremists and anti-civil libertarians and racists and those of all sorts who are using their free speech to advocate against our very own civil liberties principles. And that has always been controversial, even within the organization itself. So, for example, in the time of the Skokie case, where the ACLU defended the free speech rights of a group of neo-Nazis to demonstrate in Skokie, Illinois, a town that had a large population of Holocaust survivors, as well as other Jewish people. The ACLU lost 15% of our membership.
Wow.
15% of card-carrying ACLU members turned in their membership cards. And I'm not aware of any withdrawal of membership at all, of any note at all, after the Charlottesville case. It is true that there's a lot of discussion, including among ACLU staff members and other leaders, about whether we should continue to use any resources at all for these cases. To that extent, I welcome the New York Times invitation to revisit the issue. In the past, I wrote a long law review article back in the early 90s. I told you everything is cyclical. So at that time, there was a big debate about, is the ACLU spending too many resources on social justice issues and equal justice issues, including women's equality, and is it ignoring its historic commitment to free speech? So I wrote something for the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review explaining why I believe that all of these causes are mutually interdependent. As a result of the New York Times article, I wrote something else, which I'm happy to say is going to be published soon in a new journal of free speech law, where I again very strongly support the ACLU's continued defense of free speech rights, even for people who are crusading against other rights that we support, because I think it's absolutely essential for, first, as a matter of principle, but secondly, as a matter of organizational strategy and legitimacy and credibility. Our advocacy in support of racial justice, gender justice, any other cause is going to be stronger if it is understood as coming from a position of neutral principle, rather than simply yet another interest group that's advocating on behalf of the interests or rights of particular people.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about how those things have to go hand in hand. Another thing that the New York Times article brought up is there have been some strange comments from some, ACLU attorneys. Like there was one tweet from Chase Strangio, prominent ACLU attorney, where he said that a certain book he would die on the hill of the ideas in the book not being circulated. That was Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage. And I mean, so certainly he has the right to tweet it and to say it. I would defend that right. But what do you think do you think it's fair for people to point to that and say, hey, what's going on? Is this the same ACLU we know?
It's certainly the same ACLU that I have known and loved, because we practice what we preach. And going back to an earlier point, even though the Constitution and the First Amendment do not bind any private sector entities, the ACLU has always advocated that employers should, even private sector employers, should respect their employees' basic civil liberties, including freedom of speech. And we've supported legislation that toward that end. And as long as the speech is not disruptive of what the work is, so it would be hypocritical for us not to defend free speech rights of an ACLU employee who clearly is expressing only his individual perspective, clearly not purporting to speak on behalf of the organization, and not in any way interfering with the organization proceeding to take very different positions on the free speech issues, including on the denial of publication rights, or I can't remember exactly what the controversy was, but we would certainly come to the defense of equal access to publication opportunities, regardless of how unpopular your point of view is. And even if publishers don't have a legal obligation, of course, to publish something. Um, I'm not going to purport to speak for the ACLU, but I believe very, very strongly that publishers have a responsibility, the way librarians have a professional responsibility to promote the widest access to ideas and information and perspectives, especially on important issues of public policy. And it would be really damaging, not only to the right of individual authors to convey their points of view, but also to the rights of readers to have access to that point of view. And it also undermines democracy. All of us should have the opportunity when we're, lobbying or voting on issues, communicating with our elected officials, to hear a range of perspectives on those issues.
Mhm. Now, what do you say to the argument that we should make sure to stifle speech that is untruthful or misleading? Or, this is something that I've heard from someone like Ibram X. Kendi, who is now a very prominent anti-racist writer and activist. And he makes this argument that we should censor or limit what he calls unfree speech, which I think he would define as misleading and discriminatory. So what's your response to that? The sort of like, okay, truthful speech is okay, but untruthful speech isn't okay.
Well, let's, again, if I had somebody advocating that point of view, I would like to say, and whom are you going to trust to decide not only what is truthful and what is not truthful, but what is misleading and what is not misleading? And I have no doubt that I could look at his writings and find many, many statements that many other people would say are, if not untruthful, misleading. And I don't say that critically. All of us engage, or I shouldn't say all of us, but many of us engage in hyperbole, to make rhetoric, to make a point, or, it could be ironic. There are all kinds of contexts in which you are saying something that is literally not true, but you don't intend thereby to do any damage to somebody, right? But even beyond that, there are very few hard and fast factual matters that are of public concern. I mean, there might be certain relatively trivial facts like 2 + 2 = 4, or the sun rises in the east, but nobody's going to get in a debate about those. Where the debate arises is over mixed questions of fact and opinion. In other words, we've got a lot of data. How do you interpret the data? And as we've seen recently in the context of COVID, even the very same scientists using the very same scientific methods, as new data come in or as new understandings arise, they arrive at different conclusions. And so again, I think it's much, much, much more dangerous, infinitely more dangerous, to empower a government official to purport to separate the true from the false, or worse yet, the misleading from the non-misleading, than it is to trust the marketplace of ideas. We've seen these laws passed in other countries, and quite predictably, whatever is critical of government or inconsistent with government policy, that's what's branded as untruthful or misleading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of the actually, maybe I'll ask you about your book about hate speech and why we should combat it with more free speech. And I know you've talked a bit about cancel culture in the past. And I think I heard you say when you were speaking with David Bernstein on his podcast that you've noticed that students seem to have a real fear of a social repercussion in particular right now, more than they might fear some kind of like official authoritative repercussions for their speech. So can you talk a little bit about that, your thoughts on, is there a cancel culture? Is there a fear of, is there a chilling effect going on right now in certain areas?
Yes, Sasha. Well, first of all, I do want to say there are still official government efforts to suppress speech, including of students, including by public school officials. And so we certainly have to fight those. And I'm very proud and delighted that the ACLU won a major victory in that arena very recently in the Supreme Court when 8-1, it agreed with us that our client, who had been a high school cheerleader, who was sanctioned because of a social media post that she posted on a weekend at a convenience store and used language that the school considered to be vulgar. I guess she used the F word many, many times. And the Supreme Court very strongly protected her free speech right. And basically, it had really strong language saying schools are nurseries of democracy. So we do have to continue to be concerned about government censorship. But as that case illustrates, when it's government censorship, we have the First Amendment in our corner. We can challenge it successfully. When we're talking about private sector censorship, either the social media, as we talked about before, there's no First Amendment recourse. They can kick off. Twitter's terms of service literally say, we can kick you off for any reason or no reason at any time. And that's true for all of them. So that's a real problem. And another example is so-called cancel culture, which is people exercising their free speech rights, to be sure, advocating various kinds of retribution against other people who have said things that they consider to be offensive or not politically correct or not sufficiently woke, you name it. And it has an absolutely devastating impact on the actual climate of free speech. I think most people realistically, in the United States at least, are not so much afraid that government's going to crack down on their speech. Yes, there are exceptions. And I do want one other exception is we've had a lot of police violence against peaceful protesters. That's a problem. But the average person going about everyday business is much more concerned about the potential adverse impact of having your peers, your fellow employees, your fellow students think that you are some kind of an ist or some kind of an obe, right? That you're engaging in discrimination or having dangerous ideas. And you alluded to students, but surveys repeatedly show, including very recent surveys, that this is a problem across our entire society. Not only students and faculty members, but people in general. And it's pervasive across the entire ideological spectrum and the entire age spectrum. The only group that seems to feel less self-censored than others are those at the extreme left of the political spectrum. But even people who call themselves liberals say that they're afraid of being attacked by people who are more to the left of them, of not being sufficiently progressive. And this leads to massive self-censorship to the extent that people are reporting that they just avoid discussing race, they avoid discussing gender. And that's absolutely tragic when we have so many pressing issues of public policy that revolve around race and gender.
Mhm. Yeah, and then there's also the element of cancel culture of getting people fired, which of course I have personal experience in, and and I've seen it happen now to many other people. I've interviewed a lot of them, and there is something so chilling about the fact that you could get fired for expressing a certain opinion. And I wonder if the way to combat that is actually through employment law. I mean, we have, at will employment here. So the employer, just like Twitter, they can get rid of you at any time for any reason. So I've noticed that, and in my case and in other cases, that the employer was really just ready to give in to the mob when they felt the stirrings of the mob come after them in their business, which I think is understandable. I do. Even my employer, I think they were doing the practical thing to save their business. and it's possible that they would have gone down if they hadn't thrown me overboard. But how do we deal with that in the culture? Is it through better employment laws where the employer has something to stand on, where they say that, where they could say to the mob, oh, we actually can't get rid of this person just because they said that or tweeted that on their own time? Or, you know, is it more cultural, sort of opening up conversations? Like, how do we combat that?
I think both of the above. And Sasha, this goes back to the earlier conversation about the ACLU employee, right? And seriously, for many, many decades, the ACLU has advocated for laws in the private sector workplace for employers above a certain size, just the way the anti-discrimination civil rights laws apply to employers above a certain size, that they should not be able to fire employees for exercising what would be constitutionally protected rights in the public sector. So I think that's really important. I doubt that there's any much if any political support for that now, but it seems to me, this could be something that could gather momentum, right? As especially when we talk about those surveys of so many people feeling so frightened about losing their jobs. And by the way, it is a realistic fear, as you say, and it would be a wonderful kind of shield for the employer, as you say, that I'm powerless, my hands are tied by the law. We also do, and so I think you should start organizing some kind of advocacy, if you haven't already, for that kind of law. And usually that kind of employee protection law usually starts at the state level. That's where we saw the first anti-discrimination laws long before the federal civil rights law. I think that's an excellent idea, and there may be organizations that are focusing on it. But you're absolutely right that we need to have a change in our culture. Surveys show that the mob speaks only for a minority, but it's a well-organized minority, and the rest of us are suffering behind self-censorship and timorousness. So if somehow we could inject more willingness into each other to speak up in defense of somebody who's exercised free speech rights and to resist the canceling, that's something that is called for in John Rauch's book, which I mentioned to you. The last chapter of the book is called, Unmute Yourself. And he points to social psychology studies that show that sometimes all it takes is just one person speaking up against the mob and in defense of the person who's attacked, and it can make an enormous difference. Those of us who have relatively secure positions, such as tenured professors, I think have an enormous responsibility to use our extra freedom of speech and with because we don't have that threat of economic repercussions, to speak in support of other people. And lately some organizations have been founded to do just that. So in the academic sector, earlier this year, a group was founded called the Academic Freedom Alliance. We all pledged to speak up in defense of any professor whose free speech rights are being threatened, including by a mob or cancel culture, even if we thoroughly disagree with what the person has said.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we start to wrap up, I want to ask one kind of big question. Maybe it's kind of a two-part question, but I want to ask you, put to you, what are the limits of free speech? What should be the limits? What are the limits, and why? And then also I wanted to bring up your a previous book that you wrote about pornography and why that should be defended as free speech. And you were counter arguing to like the Andrea Dworkin feminist philosophy, which was extremely anti-pornography and wanted to, I think, censor it and stifle it with law. So that is an ongoing debate and discussion. I wonder if you have changed your views on that, or if they remain the same, if you could explain to people why, what are the limits of free speech and why pornography is free speech.
Well, those are big questions and very important ones. So this will be kind of the soundbite summary of very complex matters. Then maybe we have to have a sequel to pursue them in more depth.
I
But
love that.
um, I would too. I already told you that the bedrock principle that protects free speech is that government may never suppress any expression solely because of disagreement with or dislike of the idea, the viewpoint, the message of the speech. But once you get beyond the message or the content of the speech, and you look at the speech in its overall context, if in the particular facts and circumstances, the speech directly causes or threatens certain specific, imminent, serious harm, then the speech can and should be censored. And I already gave you an example. When those obnoxious Unite the Right white supremacists were chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," what an odious viewpoint, but that's not a justification for censoring it. However, when they then gathered en masse, confronting the counter demonstrators who were assembled in front of the Thomas Jefferson statue, very close distance, menacing them, crowding in on them, brandishing their lighted tiki torches, that crossed the line and actually satisfies, the Supreme Court has recognized several subcategories of speech that pose an emergency, right? Certain imminent, specific, serious danger that is directly caused by the speech. And this falls into the category that's called a true threat. When the speaker is addressing a limited audience and intends to instill a reasonable fear that the audience is going to be subject to harm. And that clearly was satisfied at that point and should have been punished. Another example that's been in the news a lot lately of speech that satisfies, again, what's often called the emergency concept in general. A specific type of speech that satisfies that is intentional incitement of imminent violence, where the violence is likely to happen imminently. But if there's a more indirect, speculative connection between the speech and the feared harm, that's not enough to justify censoring it. That's the standard that is used in many other countries with respect to hate speech. It's the standard that was used in the United States until the 1960s, and it was called the bad tendency test. Any speech that might potentially, indirectly, at some future time, lead to harm can be punished. Well, when you think about it, that pretty much encompasses any speech. And when the government has that much latitude, predictably, it exercises its discretion to suppress speech of those who are advocating for law reform. So we get back to an earlier point that censorship falls on those who are advocating racial justice and civil rights and gender justice and so forth. Now, in terms of pornography, the term has no specific legal meaning. It means, expression that's sexually oriented. The McDworkinites, as I called them, Andrea Dworkin and Catherine MacKinnon and their followers, tried to create a new legal concept, which they called pornography. And they defined it as sexually explicit expression that is demeaning or degrading or dehumanizing to women. Their rationale was that this leads to violence and discrimination against women. And so you understand that this is part of the same general discussion we've been having throughout this wonderful interview, Sasha. And that is that words and images do not necessarily lead to violence or discrimination, that if you empower the government through such overbroad and inherently vague concepts as demean and dehumanize and degrade, anything can be subject to censorship on that rationale. And my book includes examples that range from the Bible, which certainly has what many people would consider to be degrading descriptions of women, to feminist books. Indeed, when Andrea Dworkin's books were the first ones to be censored at the US-Canadian border when Canada adopted a version of her very own law. if you've looked at any of her books, in the process of denouncing pornography, she gives enormous examples of pornography, right? And so especially those of us who care about meaningfully promoting women's equality and combating violence against women should be the last ones to advocate censoring so-called pornography.
Hmm. So, and maybe I'll have to save this for if I get to interview you again sometime, but I guess we could address the exploitation happening in pornography, not with speech laws, not with censorship, but with laws about, or just enforcement of existing laws about actual harm being done or exploitation of the people involved in the situations. And because that seems to be the main opposition to it. Well, maybe I'm wrong. That's not the main opposition, that there are real people being harmed physically. But
Any kind of exploitation is illegal. Interestingly enough, sex workers, to the best of my knowledge, unanimously opposed this kind of legislation in the same way that sex workers opposed some recent amendment to the federal internet law that was allegedly to protect them. But as they pointed out, when you make it illegal or when you drive it off the internet and onto the streets, that becomes harder to enforce workplace safety laws and laws against abuse and violence.
hmm. Interesting. Well, thank you, Nadine. You've given me a lot to think about. And I just want to wrap up with one final little question, which is what should people go read now besides your books and your most recent book? What do you recommend that we take a look at? People who are listening, who are interested in these issues and want to know more, what articles or books do you recommend?
Wow, I would recommend a website or two, Sasha, if that's okay,
Mhm.
because I think you can get more exposure to a different, broader array than through long books. So I would recommend on Kansas Free Speech, the FIRE website, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. FIRE is staunchly nonpartisan and has come to the defense of free speech rights for perspectives all across the ideological spectrum, because in some campuses it's the liberal speech that gets squelched and in others it's the conservative, and they have excellent background resources as well. And the other website that I would recommend is Heterodox Academy, which it was formed about a little bit more than 5 years ago to promote intellectual heterodoxy, to counter the orthodoxy that seems to be spreading on campuses around the United States. And it is in pursuit of truth. It's got a mission that's a little bit separate from free speech, but so important that if we are, and this goes back to an earlier theme in our conversation, if we really are to find out the truth about anything, including the causes and prevention of COVID, we need to have different perspectives exchanged, different interpretations, and not just one orthodoxy that's commanded from the top. So Heterodox Academy has a lot of really interesting and thought-provoking materials along that important theme too.
Excellent. Well, I'll have those linked below so people can access them easily. And thank you so much, Nadine, for giving me your time today.